The following episode is based on publicly available sources and is intended for educational purposes only. It includes details of violence and may not be suitable for all listeners. Discretion is advised. She was 20 years old, confused, heavily medicated, and locked in a psychiatric hospital. She had never met the victim, yet Sandra Hemme was convicted of murder and would spend 43 years behind bars. How did this happen? In every crime, there's the story you hear, and the truth buried beneath it. You're listening to The Case Room, where we dive deep into true crime stories from around the world, one case at a time. Episode 2, 43 Years Stolen, the Sandra Hemme story. Before we open today's case, please note that this episode discusses sensitive themes, including mental illness, institutional abuse, police misconduct, wrongful imprisonment, and graphic descriptions of a violent crime, including homicide. Some listeners may find this content distressing. Listener discretion is advised. It's 1980 in St. Joseph, Missouri, a quiet city nestled along the banks of the Missouri River. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and crime is something you hear about on the evening news, not from across the street. But on a cold November morning, the body of 31-year-old librarian Patricia Jeschke is discovered in her apartment. Strangled, bound, and lifeless. Her murder sends a jolt through the city. Detectives are under pressure. The media swarms. A killer must be found. But what happens when the pursuit of justice becomes the pursuit of convenience? Enter Sandra Hemme, a soft-spoken young woman struggling with schizophrenia, freshly released from a psychiatric hospital. She has no history of violence, no motive, and no evidence tying her to the crime. But within days, she's interrogated, heavily medicated, and coerced into giving a series of inconsistent statements. Statements that would become the foundation of one of Missouri's longest-running, wrongful convictions. What followed was 4 decades of silence. 43 years locked away in a prison cell, while the real suspect, a former police officer, lived freely. Despite being tied to the crime through stolen property, suspicious behaviour, and a trail of ignored evidence. This isn't just the story of a murder. It's the story of how the system failed, repeatedly, of how mental illness was misunderstood, how a young woman's vulnerability was exploited, and how the truth was buried for over 4 decades. This is a story of injustice, yes, but also of endurance, advocacy, and the long, painful path toward redemption. Chapter 1. Sandra Hemme, A Life Interrupted. In the heartland of America, nestled along the Missouri River, lies the city of St. Joseph, a place where the pace of life is gentle and the community close-knit. But for Sandra Hemme, this city would become the backdrop of a life derailed by a tragic miscarriage of justice. Born in the early 1960s, Sandra's early years were marked by challenges that few could comprehend. From the tender age of 12, she grappled with severe mental health issues, including auditory hallucinations and episodes of derealization. These struggles led to her spending the majority of her adolescence in various psychiatric institutions across Missouri. By the time she reached 20, Sandra's life had been a continuous cycle of hospitalizations and treatments. In November 1980, she was a patient at St. Joseph State Hospital, seeking help for her mental health and substance use issues. Her days were filled with therapy sessions, medication regimens, and the hope of finding stability in a world that often felt overwhelming. But the sanctuary she sought within the hospital walls would soon become a place of vulnerability. On November 13, 1980, the body of 31-year-old librarian Patricia Jeschke was discovered in her apartment, brutally murdered. The community was shaken, and the pressure on law enforcement to find the perpetrator was immense. Sandra, with no connection to the victim and no evidence linking her to the crime, became an unexpected focus of the investigation. While still under psychiatric care, she was subjected to intense interrogations by the police. Reports indicate that during these sessions, Sandra was heavily medicated, at times so sedated that she couldn't hold her head up and was restrained in a chair. Under these coercive conditions, Sandra made a series of inconsistent and contradictory statements. These confessions became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against her, despite the absence of any physical evidence tying her to the crime scene. As we delve deeper into the events that led to this tragic miscarriage of justice, we must ask ourselves, how did a young woman seeking help become ensnared in a web of false confessions and suppressed evidence? And what can we learn to ensure that such a travesty never happens again? Chapter 2. The Crime. On the morning of November 13th, 1980, the quiet city of St. Joseph, Missouri, awoke to a chilling discovery that would unsettle its sense of safety for decades to come. Patricia Jeschke, a 31-year-old librarian known for her dedication and warmth, failed to report to work at the St. Joseph Public Library. Patricia was described by co-workers as kind, hard-working and professional. She was well liked at the library where she worked. According to her mother, Patricia was a caring and independent woman who loved her job and was close with her family. Concerned by her uncharacteristic absence, her colleagues attempted to reach her, but their calls went unanswered. Alarmed, Patricia's mother, Helen McLaughlin, decided to check on her daughter. Unable to enter the locked apartment, she broke a window to gain access. Inside, she found a scene that would haunt her forever. Patricia's lifeless body lay on the floor of her bedroom. She was nude, her hands bound behind her back with a telephone cord, and a pair of pantyhose was wrapped tightly around her neck. A knife was discovered beneath her head, and a pillow had been placed over her face. The brutality of the crime was evident, and the community was left in shock. Chapter 3. The Investigation. The pressure on law enforcement to solve the case was immense, and the investigation quickly became a race against time. Detective Lloyd Peasley was assigned to lead the investigation. Detectives worked tirelessly, processing the crime scene and interviewing potential witnesses. Over 200 leads were pursued, but none yielded a viable suspect. The lack of forced entry into Patricia's apartment suggested she might have known her attacker, or that the perpetrator had found another means of access. As days turned into weeks, the pressure to solve the case intensified. The community demanded answers, and the police were determined to provide them. Yet, the investigation yielded few leads, and the case began to grow cold. Then, a new development emerged. Sandra Hemme, a 20-year-old psychiatric patient at St. Joseph State Hospital, came to the attention of the investigators. Sandra had a history of mental health issues, including auditory hallucinations and episodes of derealization. She had been in and out of psychiatric institutions since the age of 12. At the time of Patricia's murder, Sandra had been discharged from the hospital and had travelled across the state, eventually returning to the facility. Her erratic behaviour and presence in the area during the time of the crime made her a person of interest. Sandra was in a severe mental health crisis, reportedly hallucinating, paranoid, and disoriented. Patricia was not known to associate with Sandra, and no evidence ever suggested they had met. The police had no viable leads after weeks of pressure, and they were desperate. A hospital staff member allegedly mentioned to police that Sandra had made vague statements about something bad happening in town. Sandra was then pulled from psychiatric care, who was heavily medicated and psychotic, and interrogated multiple times without an attorney present. Her initial statements were incoherent, but police guided her toward confirming details about the murder. Many of those details were not public at the time, raising strong suspicion that investigators fed them to her. During her interrogation, Sandra had identified Joseph Wabsky as the killer, and he was arrested. Her statements were inconsistent, but she was charged with concealing knowledge of the crime and Wobski was charged with murder. Despite the lack of physical evidence, her coerced confessions became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Wobski did have a criminal record, however, he provided a solid alibi. His alibi was corroborated by multiple witnesses and business records, placing him in Topeka, Kansas, at the time of the murder. The charges against him were subsequently dropped. Despite this, Sandra was charged with murder on December 10, 1980. Her initial confession was obtained during the 8th police interrogation, a session where she was heavily medicated and restrained. Sandra's mental state during these interrogations raised serious concerns about the reliability of her statements. The investigation's focus on Sandra, despite the lack of physical evidence and her compromised mental state, highlighted significant flaws in the investigative process. The urgency to solve the case overshadowed the need for a thorough and unbiased investigation. As the case progressed, critical evidence pointing to another suspect, Michael Holman, a former police officer, was overlooked. Holman had attempted to use Patricia's credit card shortly after her murder and possessed items belonging to her. Despite this, he was never thoroughly investigated, and crucial evidence pointing to his involvement was withheld during Sandra's trial. The community, desperate for closure, accepted the narrative presented by the authorities. Sandra was charged with Patricia's murder, and the case was considered solved. But as time would reveal, the true story was far more complex and tragic. The real perpetrator remained at large, and an innocent woman was about to endure a decades-long nightmare. The investigation into Patricia Jeschke's murder, marred by tunnel vision and a rush to judgment, ultimately led to the wrongful conviction of Sandra Hemme. It wasn't until decades later that the truth began to surface, revealing the grave miscarriage of justice that had occurred. Chapter 4. The Trial. In the spring of 1981, Sandra Hemme stood before the Buchanan County Circuit Court, charged with the capital murder of Patricia Jeschke. At just 21 years old, Sandra was a young woman grappling with severe mental health issues. Her life had been a series of hospitalizations and treatments, and now she faced the gravest of accusations. On April 10, 1981, Sandra entered a guilty plea to the charge of capital murder. The state recommended a sentence of life imprisonment rather than the death penalty. However, Judge Fred Schonlaub initially refused to accept her plea, stating that Sandra had not given sufficient testimony to satisfy all elements of the charge. After a short recess, the parties reconvened and Sandra again pled guilty. This time the judge accepted the plea and she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 50 years. But the story didn't end there. In 1982, Sandra moved to withdraw her plea, citing ineffective assistance of counsel. Her new attorney argued that her initial lawyer had failed to fully investigate her mental health history and had not adequately assessed her competency to stand trial. The motion was denied, but in 1984, the Missouri Court of Appeals reversed the decision, ordering a new trial. On June 4, 1985, Sandra's case went to trial. The proceedings lasted just one day. The prosecution's case hinged entirely on Sandra's earlier statements, obtained during her time in the psychiatric hospital. These statements were read to the jury, despite being inconsistent and obtained under questionable circumstances. No physical evidence linked Sandra to the crime, and no witnesses placed her at the scene. Sandra's defense attorney portrayed her as a vulnerable young woman who had falsely confessed under duress. He highlighted the lack of physical evidence and pointed to another suspect, Michael Holman, a former police officer. However, the jury was not presented with this information, as the prosecution had failed to disclose it during the trial. Despite the glaring inconsistencies and lack of evidence, the jury found Sandra guilty of capital murder. She was again sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 50 years. The conviction was upheld in March 1986, and Sandra remained incarcerated for the next 43 years. Sandra's trial serves as a stark reminder of the flaws within the justice system, particularly when it comes to individuals with mental health issues. Her conviction was based solely on coerced confessions, obtained while she was heavily medicated and vulnerable. The suppression of exculpatory evidence and the failure to investigate alternative suspects contributed to a grave miscarriage of justice. Chapter 5. The Path to Exoneration. After decades behind bars, Sandra's unwavering pursuit of justice began to bear fruit in the early 2000s. In 2006, she reached out to the Innocence Project, a non-profit organisation dedicated to exonerating wrongfully convicted individuals through DNA testing and reforming the criminal justice system. Her case caught the attention of attorneys who were struck by the lack of physical evidence and the reliance on coerced confessions obtained while she was under heavy sedation in a psychiatric hospital. The legal team, including Jane Pucher and Andrew Lee from the Innocence Project, and Sean O'Brien, a law professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, began a meticulous review of Sandra's case. They uncovered a trove of suppressed evidence and investigative oversights that pointed to a different suspect, Michael Holman, a former St. Joseph police officer. Holman had attempted to use Patricia Jeschke's credit card the day after her murder, and items belonging to Patricia were found in his possession. Despite this, he was never thoroughly investigated, and crucial evidence linking him to the crime was withheld during Sandra's trial. In February 2023, Sandra's legal team filed a petition for a writ of habeas corpus, asserting that her constitutional rights had been violated and that she was actually innocent of the crime. The petition highlighted the prosecution's failure to disclose exculpatory evidence and the ineffective assistance of her trial counsel. An evidentiary hearing was scheduled for January 2024, where new evidence was presented, including testimonies that further implicated Holman and underscored Sandra's innocence. On June 14, 2024, Livingston County Circuit Court Judge Ryan Horseman granted the writ, overturning Sandra's conviction. He stated that no evidence whatsoever outside of Ms. Hemme's unreliable statements connects her to the crime, and emphasised the substantial evidence pointing to Holman's involvement. The judge ordered that Sandra be released unless the state decided to retry her within 30 days. Chapter 6. Release and Reunion. After 43 years behind bars, Sandra Hemme's journey toward freedom culminated on July 19, 2024. The gates of Chillicothe Correctional Centre opened, and Sandra stepped out into the warm embrace of her family, marking the end of a harrowing chapter in her life. Her release was the result of a relentless legal battle. In June 2024, Livingston County Circuit Court Judge Ryan Horseman overturned her conviction, citing clear and convincing evidence of her actual innocence. In contrast, substantial evidence pointed to Michael Holman, a former police officer, as the likely perpetrator. What do we know about Michael Holman? Holman had left the police force under suspicion of misconduct. He had a history of breaking and entering, theft, and other crimes. Importantly, he had committed burglary at Patricia's apartment building before and had reportedly stalked women in the area. Just one day after Patricia's murder, Holman tried to use her credit card. He had Patricia's jewellery and other belongings in his possession. His alibi was inconsistent and contradicted by evidence. He failed a polygraph about the murder. During interviews, Holman allegedly gave statements that indicated knowledge of the crime scene that had not been made public. The police knew about his suspicious behaviour very early in the investigation. Despite this, they never charged Holman. Sandra's coerced confession gave police a convenient solution to the crime. Once they locked in on her, they apparently lost interest in pursuing Holman. Crucially, the prosecution withheld much of the evidence about Holman from Sandra's defence. Michael Holman went on to live as a free man. According to court documents, He continued to be involved in other criminal activity, but was never charged in relation to Patricia's murder. He died in 2015, having never faced accountability for the crime. In overturning Sandra Hemme's conviction, Judge Ryan Horseman specifically pointed out that the state failed to disclose powerful evidence implicating another viable suspect, Michael Holman. The evidence against Mr. Holman was far more substantial than the unreliable statements used to convict Ms. Hemme. The judge also noted that no reasonable jury today would convict Sandra given what is now known about Holman. Despite the court's ruling, Sandra's release was not immediate. Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey appealed the decision and fought to keep her incarcerated. It wasn't until Judge Horseman threatened to hold the Attorney General's office in contempt that Sandra was finally freed. Upon her release, Sandra's first destination was the hospital bedside of her ailing father, who was battling acute kidney failure. She spent 10 precious days with him before he passed away, a bittersweet reunion after decades of separation. Sandra now resides with her sister in mid-Missouri, adjusting to life outside prison walls. But even after her exoneration, justice for Sandra remains incomplete. Under Missouri law, wrongful conviction compensation is only guaranteed when innocence is proven through DNA evidence, something that was never part of Sandra's case. As a result, despite losing 43 years of her life to a crime she did not commit, Sandra has received no automatic compensation from the state. Now in her 60s, she cannot collect Social Security and faces serious financial uncertainty. Her legal team is preparing to sue the state and local authorities in civil court, but such battles are long and uncertain. For Sandra Hemme, freedom came at an unimaginable cost, and so far no one has paid it but her. Sandra's story is a testament to resilience and the enduring human spirit. Her release not only marks a personal victory, but also serves as a stark reminder of the flaws within the justice system and the importance of vigilance to prevent such miscarriages of justice. Chapter 7. Closing Thoughts. Patricia Jeschke, the victim in this case, often gets overlooked in news stories about Sandra Hemme's wrongful conviction. Understandably, much reporting has focused on the injustice to Sandra. But we must also remember that this case began with a young woman who was brutally murdered, and justice was never served for her either. Sandra's story is not just about a wrongful conviction, it's about everything that went wrong in the pursuit of justice. She was 20 years old when she was arrested, heavily sedated in a psychiatric hospital, suffering from untreated schizophrenia, and subjected to multiple coercive interrogations. She had no criminal record, no motive, no forensic evidence linked her to the murder, and yet she was convicted of killing a woman she had never met. It's a case that makes you pause. A case that reveals the devastating consequences of tunnel vision, of prosecutorial misconduct, of ineffective defence, and of a legal system ill-equipped to protect the most vulnerable among us. Sandra lost 43 years of her life, not because she was guilty, but because she was convenient. As Sandra walks free today, adjusting to a world that moved on without her, we're left with more than just outrage. We're left with questions. What would justice look like now? Can it ever truly be served for someone who lost their youth, their family milestones, their future? What about those responsible? The prosecutors, the investigators, the judges, who overlooked the truth? And perhaps most hauntingly, how many more Sandras are still behind bars? The exoneration of Sandra Hemme is a triumph, but a bittersweet one, because for every wrongful conviction uncovered, there's a human life behind it, a life paused, a voice silenced. Sandra never stopped trying to prove her innocence. For decades her voice was ignored, until finally someone listened. That, in itself, should be a call to all of us, to journalists, to advocates, to citizens, to listen harder, to question deeper, and to demand better from the systems built to protect us. This has been the story of Sandra Hemme, a tragedy that reminds us that behind the headlines are real people, real consequences, and real pain. Thank you for listening, and remember to subscribe for more true crime.